All right, good morning, everybody. Not sure which camera I'm on, so I'm just going to talk generally. Welcome to the Center for Teaching Excellence. My name is Augie Grant. This is a great way to start the term. First and foremost, I want to wish everyone a happy new term. It is great to have you with us. We've got a great semester of programming ahead of us, and we're kicking it off in fine fashion. I'll talk more at the end about what we have coming up for you, but want to get right into today's presentation. Welcome to today's presentation. It's a guide to letting go of control and embracing chaos when teaching. If there's anything we all need this term. With us today is Travis Wagner. He's a PhD candidate in the School of Library and Information Sciences. I should say an award-winning for his work as an instructor.
Right.
In addition to being a PhD candidate, he's an instructor in the university's Women and Gender Studies department. Their primary research interests include critical information studies, queer archives, and social advocacy in libraries. The recent publications include articles in Reference Services Review and Open Information Science, and they are also the co-creator of Queer Cola Oral History and Digital Archives. So, Travis, we'll hand them over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me unless somebody runs out of an office and yells otherwise. As Augie said, I'm going to be talking to you about a guide to letting go of control and embracing chaos when teaching. I'll admit that the title's a bit clickbaity. I just admitted that via text to somebody in attendance, but I'm still going to sort of attend to those ideas. Let's go ahead and get into it. So there's my title again. By way of reminder, I'm Travis. I use they, them pronouns. If you want to tweet at me for whatever reason, there's my Twitter handle. And I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Information Science and an instructor in Women's and Gender Studies as well. So what I'm going to do today is sort of give you an introduction of myself and sort of explain to you why I think chaos is better than control when it comes to classroom pedagogy, and then give some tips for navigating the uncertainties of teaching within that concept and some sort of anecdotal explorations of what it means to me to engage in pedagogical chaos. And then I think there's time at the end, based on how I sort of deliver what I'm going to do, for questions. So who am I? Well, I have a bachelor's degree in history from Augusta State University and my master's in library and information science here from the University of South Carolina, and a graduate certificate in Women's and Gender Studies. And as I said, I'm a PhD candidate in information science. I'm genderqueer. I use they, them pronouns. I mention that because it's going to be super important to some of the advice that I'm giving you. But courses that I've taught here at the university include things like race, class, gender, and sexuality, sexual diversities, information literacy and technology, diversity in libraries, and one summer I even taught a course called Sex, Gender, and Sexuality in Horror Cinema. So the advice I'm giving to you, I hope, is applicable across a couple of different fields and speaks to how this sort of cuts across those things. And I'm also a community archivist because I think it's important to know that I'm doing work and it'll inform, again, some of the things that I want to talk to you about today. Before we get into it more, though, I want to tell you what this presentation is not about. You might have heard, oh, chaos, that means I can sort of phone in teaching. That's not the sort of talk I'm giving to you. I don't want you to be like, oh, just show up and don't grade anything, don't do anything. Your students will think you're super cool. We're not doing that. That's not what I'm interested in telling you about today. What I am interested in telling you about is how you probably already know what teaching looks like. And you're probably already fine at it. It's just about sort of adapting it. The example I always give is, when I was younger, it took me a really, really long time to sort of adapt to riding without training wheels. Now, I would go up and down the street with training wheels on, thinking, oh, I really need these to ride my bike. And then somebody pointed out one day, you've been using those so long that the training wheels have basically bent up and actually aren't on the ground anymore. So I'd been riding a bike without it, but in my mind, I needed that thing. So what I want to do today is convince you that you don't need those things. You're probably already, again, doing well without them. So let's start with a scenario. Imagine it's the spring of 2020, and you get to teach your very own class you've created from scratch. We'll take a hypothetical professor, Travis Wagner, teaching a class called Dank Memes in Digital Culture. We have this full, wonderful description. Travis is super excited to teach this class. This is related to Travis's research. And they made an entire wonderful plan that's going to involve students coming to the Social Media Insights Lab on campus. They're going to learn hands-on skills. They're going to have book clubs about super important media studies topics, and they're going to even have meet experts come talk to the class. Hypothetically, let's say that, something stops that in-person teaching from happening. Like, I don't know, maybe a global pandemic happens. But Travis is really bad about sort of adapting to that and is like, well, I don't know what to do. I plan to teach all of these things in person, and I can't adapt anything. I don't know what to do. All my guest lectures canceled on me. The Social Media Insights Lab is closed. I'm just going to spiral and take it out on my students. So Travis's wonderful dank memes class ends up just being about how they get memed instead. Now, this is an example to me of what it would look like to not adapt to the very real chaos that did happen to us as teachers. Now, this didn't actually happen to me, but it's, hypothetical. I would still love to teach a course like that. That's for another day. And what I want to tell you is that it's because we always have to understand that teaching is about this sort of engagement with both what we do have control over and what we don't have control over. You're asking yourself why Sonic is showing up. Sonic's going to come back a lot during this presentation. But what I want to tell you today is that when it comes to teaching, chaos and control are not a binary. I am a trained queer theorist and sort of queer scholar, so I'm always thinking about how we can deconstruct binaries. But if you sort of look at the definitions of chaos and control, they sort of rely on one another. And there's a lot of gray area between these two concepts that I want us to sort of nuance and explore when I give you advice for the rest of my talk. But what I want you to do is I want you to think of both of these things as a spectrum on which you're teaching. Now, I always just sort of find excuses to put rainbows into my presentations, but again, I really do want you to consider how these two concepts that you've been told maybe are opposites of one another have a lot of space for nuance between them. So what this is going to be about for the rest of the time that I talk to you is about when to embrace chaos and when to assert control. Plot twist, there's not going to be a lot of control assertion because of how I sort of understand relationships with students, but we'll get into that and maybe can talk more about that in the questions and answers should we have time. But as I mentioned, Sonic is going to make a lot of cameos in this presentation. That's because for my friends who are of a certain age or big gamers, you know that in the Sonic universe, in order for Sonic to become Super Sonic, he has to get 7 Chaos Emeralds, right? It's just part of the sort of ethos of the world. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you 7, not Chaos Emeralds, but gems for the classroom. This is just sort of advice that I think is really important for how you can navigate the realities that there are things you don't have control over, but can still come to the classroom and engage with it in a meaningful and hopefully positive and impactful way with your students. But I'll go through each of these and talk about what I mean by them and give you an example of how I've done this in instruction. So the first one, and actually I want to say here that most of these are going to seem probably obvious to you. So it's just to sort of embrace the thing that you already know to be true. So the first thing I would tell you to do is to make the class uniquely your own. Of course, this is easier said than done because there are lots of rules that you have to follow that you don't have any control over. So you might have specific learning objectives that you have to get through. You might have required readings that you don't have a choice over. This is particularly true if anyone in attendance is an English 101 or 102 instructor. You have a pre-described book that you have to assign. And there are topics covered that you just sort of have to attend to. But once you have all of those things in front of you, how you get to those things in a classroom is entirely up to you. And I think it's important to remember that. So you don't like a reading for a class, assign a counter reading. Talk about what you don't like about it, right? You're allowed to do that within the space. If you think a learning outcome that you're required to do is absurd, call attention to that absurdity. The example that I always like to give here is there was a while, and it's been updated since then, where I was teaching information literacy and technology class that had this learning outcome that required students to describe the parts of a computer. but it was like 10 years out of date. So it was like, identify a floppy disk drive on a computer. And I was like, I don't even know if I can find a computer with a floppy disk drive on it to show students. So what I did instead was like 2 days into class, I was like, oh, here's a handout from like a 1990s computer manual where you fill in the blank with the parts. All the students are like, what is this? I've never seen a computer that looks like this before. And I was like, great. So what is it about this hardware that your relationship with it has changed so drastically? And what would you update about it? So then it became a conversation not about specifically naming the hardware, but what sort of our relationships to that hardware was and why it evolves and why it's important for us to not specifically be able to name those things, but understand that relationship instead. So I got to the objective while also being like, this is absolute nonsense. But with that being said, if you do have control over any topics, readings, or assignments, make sure that they are things that you're passionate about and that you're interested in. This will help you in your personal work, particularly for my graduate student colleagues who are in attendance, right? Anytime you can sort of strong arm work that you need to be reading for your dissertation, for being up to date in the field, do so. I say this because it helps you do it, but also we're going to translate really well to student learning because you're going to seem more excited about it. That's just like the reality of things, right? So an example that I give of this, right, as you heard in my introduction, I'm a really big fan of digital community archive type work. And part of that is sort of how things like queer cultures and punk scenes have taken up zine making as a way to communicate with one another outside of systems that historically have oppressed them. So when I teach women's and gender studies classes, I assign a zine making exercise that asks students to take any topic we've talked about and make a zine about it. In pre-pandemic times, I would have students, cut up magazines, draw art, use, construction paper, things like that. Obviously can't do that right now, or we'll see what, this semester looks like. But I was like, there are tons of things on like the Internet Archive that are just decades and decades of magazines that students sort of can have access to and can make a digital version of a zine instead. So I just broke them into groups and I was like, here, hop online. Here's some examples of zines, talk about a topic we've talked about. And this is just one sort of screen grab about heteronormativity that the students sort of defined it and then tracked through a bunch of different eras how it was being represented. I didn't tell them to, make this brilliant sort of visual representation of heteronormativity. They just took up the topic and we were able to sort of have this really great definition. And again, I could have just been, write me a paragraph about heteronormativity. I didn't want to read that. They didn't want to do that. So I found a way to sort of weave in what I cared about and translate it in a really, really wonderful way. So next piece of advice for you is borrow liberally from your former teachers. This is, to me, one of the best unspoken rules that nobody actually tells you is fine to do. So what I want you to do, and I won't actually call on you to do any of this, but I want you to take a moment and think about some of your favorite professors, teachers from high school, things like this, right? What made them great? What was their class like? What were their assignments like? As you're thinking about that, I can assure you, or I can't assure you, I don't know what you think, but there's a high likelihood that it had very little to do specifically with the topic of the course or the learning objectives, right? It had to do with something about how they engaged with you as a student. If you really like that, there is nothing stopping you from borrowing that exact practice, right? That being said, so long as for whatever reason it's not like a trademark pedagogical practice, there's a very low likelihood that's the case, but just be careful of that. But again, if you like an assignment they gave you, they like a way that they instructed, utilize it and make your own version of that assignment. What I would also tell you to do is if you do that and you are in contact with that professor, let them know that you're borrowing from them. I can't tell you how many times I've told professors that, and it made their day. It's like, I took this method, and it really works in my class. I think that sort of communication is really, really important. The other thing I will say is that sort of taking this approach of borrowing from instructional heroes or role models is so much more generative to you than any how-to book probably ever will be. Not to say that you shouldn't read how-to books if that's a thing that works for you. Just maybe try this approach first instead. And another thing from this sort of advice is you're not committed to like one teaching style or practice inside of a classroom. If you're borrowing from multiple people, use the Socratic method sometimes, right? Have peer-led pedagogy, have lectures on occasion, right? You can mix and match in a classroom. You're not committed to one of those things once you start teaching. And I'm happy in the Q&A if you want to sort of talk about times when I switch those up and when I think it's super important to do so. So an example of this for me is, and this is going to run a little counterintuitive to some of the other advice I give you, is that I borrowed this practice from my undergraduate history professor, Dr. McClellan-Nugent, of giving pop quizzes to students, particularly to sort of show them that, we are going to engage in discussion in this class. Now, what I didn't know when I was an undergrad is when she assigned pop quizzes, they were such a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of our grade that even if we failed all of them, we would still be fine in the class, but it set up this precedent that I was supposed to come to class having read and engaged with what we talked about. Now, the quizzes we had were about sort of ideas. It wasn't like identify the exact year that something happens, right? It was like, what is this reading trying to tell us about the relationship to history? So you can ask quizzes that are about the meaning of something without a yes or no answer being the end game. So what I try to tell folks with this, right, is when I assign quizzes and I have students who are just like, I didn't, know what to answer for that. I was like, well, then tell me what else stood out to you in the reading, right? Give me something to show me you did the reading, and that's what I can work with, right? Because it's not about you getting this exactly right answer, but about how you're thinking about it, right? So that's an example of how I sort of incorporate a pedagogical practice from a former professor into my own work. And again, told her that I did that and made her day. In the same vein, don't be afraid to ask other folks for help, which good news, you're already in the CTE talk. So that's a good start. You're already sort of seeking that out. But here at USC specifically, the CTE has tons of resources that they would be super excited if you came and used. Personally, terrible at writing learning objectives, so I've been sort of deliberately seeking out advice and guidance from it. I can't remember Bloom's taxonomy to save my life, but it's super useful for writing those things, right? So knowing where you're lacking can be a really great space to start, right? I'm learning this semester. I know some of the folks I'm teaching with are in the online session. If you're teaching a course with somebody else that's teaching a similar section, talk about the syllabi, share what you can between other instructors. If you didn't know you could do that, go to whoever's in charge of like course management and be like, hey, are there any previous syllabi that I can look at? Because that can be a really great way to give you the skeleton for what you're working with. But if for some reason that's not the case, I promise you Googling name of class and syllabus will provide you with tons of available resources on people who've already done that. Or you can check out opensyllabus.org, which is an intentional project to make syllabi available across a variety of disciplines about topics that are probably covered by anybody who's in attendance. The other thing I will say is, shout out to Archie who's in the room, like trade guest lectures with colleagues across fields, right? If you know you have something that you can help out a colleague with and they have something that you can step in for, do that, right? It's a really great way for you to build connections, but also have a sort of ecosystem where it's like, hey, remember that one time I did that thing for you? It'd be super cool if you could return the favor because I don't know this topic that well. And I would love to have somebody step in that day, right? It's really, really great. And again, a super obvious way, I think, to build connections both in the classroom and in your day-to-day life. And also allows your students to see a diverse set of representations in a classroom, which is important as well. The other thing I'll say is like, don't over-rely on like mediated pedagogical tools, but also don't undervalue them. Sometimes you just don't know something, and that's the day you're like, well, we're just gonna watch a documentary today, right? I know I'm not a super versed in political science topics. So sometimes when we get to like political science and gender, it's like, well, let's talk about Harvey Milk today. And here's this great documentary we can watch, right? So understanding that you are allowed to do that on occasion, as long as it's not your only form of instruction, can be really important. The other thing I will say is social media groups are a really great space for this. If you're teaching a course, go onto Facebook, Twitter, if you do those types of things, and find Facebook groups that are like educators in, you're in front of me, Archie, educators in linguistics, right? and see if there are folks who are graduate students like, hey, I'm teaching this class. I'd love your thoughts on what I should have in an introductory course. It can be really, really great to sort of give you other ways in or other topics. And again, sometimes if it's really useful, you might find collaborators to teach with. And this can be especially useful if you find out you have to teach a class like a week before it starts. An example I give of this is the course I mentioned earlier was the Gender and Sexuality in Horror Films class. I was super excited to teach it, but because it was in the summer, it wasn't clear whether or not it was actually going to make until like the day before the class started. And I have a finite amount of time in my life, so I was like, well, I'm not going to build an entire course out just to find out that, it didn't make, right? That's a lot of time and labor. I was like, but what I can do in anticipation is hint that I might be teaching this on Facebook, right? So I posted, I'm teaching this class that I'm really excited, I might be teaching this class. And I tagged some folks I knew might be interested in it and be like, what would you add to this? And like, oh, put this in. You should assign Twilight. It'd be so much funnier than an actual vampire horror movie. Things like that. And I was able to dialogue, and other people jumped in with suggestions as well. And I utilized that, right? That was completely outside of the sort of structure of traditional sort of where I get pedagogical ideas from. But I also had folks jump in and they're like, oh, I would love to see somebody talk about this. And I was like, great, you want to come talk to my class about that? And they're like, yeah, I'd love to do that. So understanding those spaces as well. This is perhaps one of the most important points to me. And that is you should assign work that liberates knowledge. And what do I mean by that? Well, first off, if you haven't read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, matter of fact, if you are like, oh, what is that? And you want to leave this talk and go read that instead, totally fine by me, because he probably has more useful things to tell you than I ever could. But what he sort of frames is this idea that knowledge within classrooms has always been about sort of regurgitation of ideas in quantitative ways, right? So what does that look like? A test that says this is the exact right answer. You need a quiz that does this. There are situations in which you can't get out of doing that, but think about how to have assignments that are reflexive in nature. They should ask how and why of the student in a way that isn't just like the what of things. And if you can, let students engage in their own personal understandings while still having graded assignments, right? So journaling, evaluation, peer reviews, and assignments are all ways to sort of get at this, right? Particularly if you bring in contemporary topics for courses as well. An example I always think of is, I'm in the social sciences, so I had to take a statistics class as part of my PhD. Not a quantitative researcher, but I had to do that. I took it with an instructor who was very intentional about being like, listen, here are numbers that you're gonna have to crunch. But he always had a question that was like, but why might we want to ask questions about the numbers that are been put in front of us, right? What sort of political climate, social climate is informing this, right? And it allowed us to think about the way that even this quantified data might be skewed or informed by the questions being asked. And it was really great. The other thing here is, if you approach things this way, if you're concerned about students cheating and things like that, it's really hard to cheat at having a personal opinion, right? I mean, not to say that somebody might find out a way to do it, but it makes it less likely, right? Another thing I like to do is just like ask students what they think about the topic of the course that they're in. So if I'm teaching a research class, the first assignment is like, tell me what you think good research is. How did you learn that? What sort of roles and values inform that? So if it's like freshmen, they'll be like, my high school teacher told me that this is what good teaching looks like. And I'll be like, okay, we can work from that and adjust and nuance it. And at the end of the semester, you can have them return to that assignment, assess the changes in that sentiment, and probably knock out most of your learning objectives in that assignment alone. Also, you just don't always have to assign a research paper. It took me a really long time to get out of this mindset, particularly when I was like teaching my first semester. Like, I'm a serious professor. I have to assign a research paper, and it has to be tough and hard. It doesn't. I mean, it can be rigorous without being unnecessarily difficult. And one example I give of this is I used to assign for my race class, gender, and sexuality classes research papers about those topics. And I was like, just write a 15-page paper, have X amount of sources. Then the pandemic hit, and it was unclear as how students were going to access a lot of the resources they traditionally used in the library. Shout out to Thomas Cooper for making that not a problem. but it was unclear at first as to whether or not that was going to be the case. So I said, well, how about you make videos instead? That might be an easier way for you to utilize the technology you have in front of you and sort of tell your sort of story that you want to tell. So I had students do that instead, and I was like, make a 7 to 10 minute video, have references to research, pick a topic that's related to the class, and the students every semester are like, thank you for assigning this. It was so much less stressful than writing a research paper. And I was like, what are you talking about? You had to do as much preparation and had to record and edit a video. How was that less? They're like, I don't know. It just seemed less stressful and allowed me to breathe and step away. And the example I love the most about this is from one of my former students, Lena. They took their video from my class and said, okay, well, I'd been talking to my sister about starting a YouTube channel where we did media analysis. So they took their video and took a 7-minute video, and as you'll see here, turned it into a 40-minute analysis of queer representation in children's TV. To me, that's the idea of what we're supposed to be doing when we're teaching, is to get a student so invested in something that they find a way to do it, engage with it outside of the class. Next piece of advice, lean on the performance of teaching. So I think you all know that there's an inherent power dynamic in student-teacher relationships, right? It's just the way we've been raised and taught about that. So if you've taught in person, the thing I always tell you to think about is like, walking into the class, there are probably students talking to each other like, oh, hey, how's it going? You know, why are you in this class? Blah, blah, blah. But once they realize you're the instructor, there's like this hushed silence that follows over the classroom because they think they're not allowed to talk anymore. And I call attention to that. It's like, why did everyone stop talking? Like, because you're here. I was like, class doesn't start for another 10 minutes. You don't have to attend to me. And that's a great way in to be like, listen, I understand that there's a role that's going to be played, but how can we immediately start challenging that? It's a little different to sort of navigate that online, but I think there are ways that we can think about doing that. I'm happy to sort of dialogue about that as well. But this is the type of thing where I said, if you can call attention to sort of the role you have and what it sort of is perceived as, it can be really generative in a classroom space. The other thing I do is I often sort of try to use dialogue in class. I think it's just my preferred way of teaching. But that requires students or practice, because the reality is students were rarely given space in class to dialogue, at least not in an open way, particularly not about socially complex topics. So when we start, you know, I'll be like, okay, well, you know, we're talking about gender roles today. What do people think gender roles are? And there'll be silence. And I'll be like, you've never once in your life thought about gender roles, and more silence. And I'll just be like, you know, like, I'm here for an hour, 15 minutes regardless. If you want to sit in silence with me, that's your choice. And eventually somebody will be like, well, I don't think I want to do that. And that'll get the dialogue rolling. But even as I'm sort of calling attention to the way in which you can challenge that relationship, the one thing that's really important for you to do is acknowledge when you mess up or say something wrong or don't know the answer to something. It humanizes you and also shows your students that, you know, I don't know everything, and I'm also in the process of learning with you as well. And that can be really, really generative. And it can also help make the content a lot more accessible. And the example I always give of that is when I'm teaching library research. The one thing that would be really easy for me to do is come to the classroom and say, okay, well, I have a set topic that I'm going to search in a specific set of search terms that are going to be really easy for me to type in, search, and find the results right away. If I do that with students, they're going to be like, how did you do that? And why was it so easy? Because when I type in the words, I don't find anything on my topic. So what I do is sort of this organic exercise where I open to the homepage and I was like, well, okay, what's your topic? What's the first thing you do? Like, I type this word in the search terms. I'm like, all right, let's do that, right? And we work together to sort of show how clunky it can be to do research, and it's not the sort of fault of the library, but understanding of the language necessary for researching in the library. And by showing that it is a thing that you can mess up on the fly helps it be less stressful when students go do it later. And I think it's helped a lot with students who would be like, who before, when I just, you know, do the terms without sort of showing them that it can be tricky, invariably the night before the assignments due, they're like, I can't find anything in the databases. was like, that's not true. But opening it up this way has been really, really helpful. The other thing I would tell you to do is to approach each class and student with humility. And this is probably one of the harder things to do, right? But what I want to say is that if you get to the point where you're complacent in teaching, this is when chaos will get the best of you. Now, I think Dr. Chuck is one of the online attendees for this class, and I think he's been teaching in our department for like, I don't know, 80 years or something like that. But one of the things he told me, he was sort of my pedagogy professor for my doctorate, and he said, you know, I come to class nervous every single time I'm teaching. And I've been doing this for a really long time because I care about making sure that this is a space that's useful to you. And I've always sort of stuck with that idea, right? Is that if I ever am not nervous about teaching, that probably means that I'm complacent. So what I want to tell you is that you're nervous as an instructor, that's probably a sign that you care about what you're doing, right? So embrace that and find ways to sort of use that in the classroom. The other thing I'll say is that there's a lot of stuff in academia that can produce stress and frustration. What I implore you to do is to, one, not let your students be one of that, and not let it equally impact your students. And particularly, I want you to think about the place that students have in the power of the university, and remember what you owe them or what you owe them in a worthwhile educational experience. I put an asterisk here because when you say owe students an education, there's a sort of literal capitalist way in which they are paying to be here, and I think we have to think about that. But also, you owe them something that isn't just something they could find on a Wikipedia article, right? Or something they could just Google and get the answers to. It's about sort of thinking about ways to engage with it in a generative and interactive way. Other thing I'll say that is super important here when it comes to humility is be prepared for students to ask you questions that have nothing to do with the course at hand. Some of these can be really personal in nature. As I mentioned, I'm open with my students about my gender queer identity, and it often leads to them sort of wanting to have conversations about their own gender identity, which just isn't something that you're prepared for, right? But I've learned to navigate. But other times the questions can be so out there that me navigating them as an instructor can be equally weird. The example I give here is I was teaching women's and gender studies class, and at the end of the class, I had a student walk up and it was just like, hey, I have a super personal question for you. I was like, all right, we're going to talk about gender identity, sexual orientation, something like that. That's usually the case. And they're like, I think my dorm room's haunted. And I was like, oh, okay. And I had to like step back, right? Because I was like, I don't believe in ghosts, but this is not the space for you to have this conversation. And so it's like, well, why do you think that? And they sort of explained to me, you know, I've been hearing these weird noises. I'm having these sort of issues with that. And they're like, how do I find out if it's somebody died in my my dorm room? And I was like, okay, well, let's maybe not ask the RA or the dorm itself, because I don't think they're going to tell you that offhand, right? I was like, but we could try setting you up an appointment with the university archives, which probably have old copies of the Daily Gamecock or records that might tell you. There was nothing, there is no how-to book that's going to prepare you for that type of thing. But what I knew in that moment was like, I can't bring in my own sort of opinions about this. The student is coming to me because they want to figure out something. It's my job to help them figure that out, right? So that's the sort of example I give there. And then finally, bring yourself to the classroom. As far as I know, and I can only see two of you, you are most likely living, breathing humans. As much as I want to be a cyborg, I'm not one, and there's no need for me to pretend otherwise. So you bring a particular lived experience to your class, and that informs your teaching and your values, and you should try to the best of your ability to explore those ideas and values in the classroom. Again, I think it's about creating a dialogue and being open, right? There's no such thing as sort of objective teaching or neutral teaching. I'm happy to debate somebody about that. It's just not, it's non-existent, but you can sort of bring those things into the space. And think about the identities you possess and what it means for students to see them. As I said, I'm open about my queer identity, and I try to make it a point of reference and discussion with students, and to sort of importantly signal to their queer students that, you know, there are folks like them in a classroom, but I'm also sort of clear that I'm a white person teaching, in a demographic space where that actually isn't representative of the population, right? So having those conversations is, why is it that this is the person who's been given authority and knowledge in this space? You can be personable without being too personal. So share the challenges you're facing in school and life without sort of dumping your problems into the space. I remember when I was taking my comprehensive exams, I just remember telling my students, I was like, oh, listen, y'all, I have to do comprehensive exams. They're like, what are those? And I sort of explained it to them. They're just like, oh, that sounds like the worst thing on earth. And you were awesome for doing it. So I was like, oh, thanks for like that affirming space. Like, what you don't want to do is go to class and be like, hey, y'all, I've been on like Tinder for 3 weeks and it's just been like a nightmare, right? Like, don't do that kind of like personal dumping, but, you know, sort of share with them who you are in that space. And this is really important to me when I was Zoom teaching, right? Just be like, this is emotionally exhausting. I don't know if it's emotionally exhausting for you all, but it is for me. And it really opened up a space where there was vulnerability to be like, yeah, we're not having a fun time either, right? The other thing you can do, sort of bring yourself to the classroom, is understand your students exist outside of the classroom, right? So you as a professor can go to student organizations, sort of, if they have extracurricular activities that are open to the public, go and support them, right? If you know one of your students is participating as a president of an organization, try to show support. Stop by campus-wide events. I give you this piece of advice because assuming we come back to some sort of normal post-pandemic, hard quotes on normal, you're gonna run into your students in Columbia. Trust me, it's going to happen. It's probably gonna happen at a bar and you're like, oh, whoa, this is weird. But it's always nice to have things to talk to them about that aren't your specific classroom. So you're like, oh, hey, have you turned in my research paper yet? They're like, haha, I didn't want to think about that. That's why I'm not at the library right now, right? So you can be like, oh, you know, how's your student organization doing? These types of things, right? Is really, really useful. My absolute favorite example of this, and probably my favorite pedagogical example to date, is I had a student who came to the University of South Carolina. He'd just come out as trans, and he had my class the first semester, and he sort of came up to me and he was like, you know, I'm here, I'm exploring this thing. I just need you to know it, and I just want you to be aware of it. And I was like, got it, let's make this. I mean, there's already a class that had trans studies built into it, but I was like, okay, thanks for sharing this, and let me know I can help make this a space that's comfortable for you, right? Between myself and a lot of really great students, we had that space happen. And at the end of his time here, he had to record a podcast for one of the media studies classes that asked them to sort of interview a professor that had an impact on him. And we sort of sat down in the recording studio, and he was like, you know, I need you to know that it was super important to me that somebody like you was in the front of the classroom, and it made a really great impact. And I looked at him and I was like, that's nice, but I need you to know how important it was that you were also in the classroom being visible as well. So I always try to tell that example about none of that had to do with, even though it was a women's gender studies class, none of that had to do with actual class pedagogy, but about just seeing my student as a fellow human being, right? So those are the sort of pieces of advice that I can give you. You have your chaos emeralds, your gems, whatever you want to do with them now. So you turned into supersonic. The one thing I want to tell you is that once you have sort of understanding of the chaos and control, right, you should never mistake the power you have as an instructor for being a reason to assert undue control in the classroom. And I think I'll conclude there. Thank you so much.
All right, here's a question from Darren Freeman. I use discussion quite heavily, but as someone who as an undergrad myself was very intimidated by this format, I worry that I'm pushing a learning modality that many students are uncomfortable with. Even starting with creative things like zines will lead eventually to a public discussion about those things. How do we get students comfortable with that? And is that even the right goal?
Yeah, I think that's a Darren question, good question. So it's great because at the end of the day, there are people who just don't want to talk in class, and I can't make them talk in class. I could require them to, which is a really weird thing to do for me as an instructor. So, and I have this in my syllabi every time, is like, I understand there are a myriad of reasons why you might not want to share your opinion vocally in class. Email me, write your words down, and I will share them with the class as a sort of anonymous question or idea. And I can't tell you how many times that's led to students being like, hey, I had a question about something and I didn't think I knew how to ask it right. Can we have a dialogue instead, right? So the discussion component of a class doesn't always have to look like a group of people talking together. It can be outside of classroom spaces as well. It's a little bit more labor as you on the part of you as an instructor, but can't open that up as well.
How big a factor is the size of the class?
I mean, it doesn't hurt, right? But that can also, that's a blessing and a curse, right? The more students you have, the more chaos, to go back to that word, that you can have, right? Sometimes you have sort of students who are maybe like in the same sorority together, who have a little pocket where they're like, we're gonna have an ideological camp here, and we're gonna judge people's sort of opinions outside of it. So that can be really challenging. But the obvious challenge for smaller classes is if you're relying on one student always talking, then it's just you two having a conversation. Your students, you'll see that like eye rolling where it's like, oh, the same person's been talking. So I always try to think about how I can reframe and sort of orient their observations to the classroom as well.
Here's another one. Should we avoid students if we see them in a bar? I know Travis recommended asking about their extracurricular activities, but I just wanted to make sure because it sounded different than what we were told at CTE orientation.
I mean, you shouldn't like buy your students a drink. Like, don't do that. Unless you know it's grad student related. Those are different relationships. Like, it's.
Is it really?
Yeah. I mean, according to this university, it's different, right? I think there's a part of that's age, right? So if you're legitimately concerned about that, right, you can build your knowledge around where you're less likely to run into undergrads. But I think outright like acting like you don't see the undergrad is a different thing from like not engaging with them in an intentional way. Yeah. So I actually don't know the CT's advice on that, but yeah, don't hang out with the undergrads at the bar, but don't avoid them. That's a weirdly inhuman thing to do.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you there. But part of engaging with students is having them see you as a complete person.
Yeah.
If they see that the information you're sharing is only related to your topic, they're going to have less engagement with what you're sharing than if they see you as a complete person.
Right.
So
yeah.
I frankly have never run into one of my students here at a bar because grocery stores, convenience stores, place I've run into more students than anywhere else is on the State House during protests.
Yeah, that's a great place. So I say bars because it has happened, but it'll be in a context like the students working at the bar, right, or the restaurant, right? These are just like things. I always try to find the extreme example, right? Because like the grocery store is like a little more, at least the way we understand that, is like a very normal routine thing, right? But the way we perceive of bars and undergraduate populations at most any college, right, is a much different thing, right?
Once again, I want to thank Travis. They have done a great job, and we appreciate their not only their commitment, but their willingness to share with everyone else.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
All right. Thank you.